picture this moment with me for just a second. You're walking through the dusty corridors of a forgotten temple, your footsteps echoing against ancient stone walls that haven't heard human voices for over 1,000 years. The air is thick with mystery, and carved into these weathered stones are stories so incredible, so mind-bending, that they make our modern superhero movies look like children's bedtime tales. These aren't the myths you learned about in school. These aren't the Greek gods or Roman legends that everyone knows. These are the forgotten stories, the lost whispers of civilizations that vanished so completely that we're only now beginning to piece together the incredible tales they left behind. What I'm about to share with you in this video will completely change how you think about ancient history and mythology. We're going to dive deep into civilizations that most people have never even heard of, exploring myths so fascinating and bizarre that they'll keep you awake at night wondering what other secrets are buried beneath our feet. From shape-shifting gods who controlled reality itself to creation stories that involve cosmic eggs and singing mountains, these forgotten myths are absolutely wild. And here's the thing that blows my mind the most. These stories weren't just entertainment for ancient people. They were their science, their religion, their entire understanding of how the universe worked. I've spent months researching these lost civilizations, digging through archaeological reports, ancient texts, and interviews with experts who've dedicated their entire careers to uncovering these mysteries. What you're about to discover are myths from cultures that thrived thousands of years ago. Cultures whose stories have been sleeping in libraries and buried sites, waiting for someone to wake them up and share them with the world. By the end of this journey together, you'll have traveled to places that most historians overlook, and you'll understand why these forgotten myths might actually hold keys to understanding human nature itself. Let's start our adventure in a place that will absolutely blow your mind. Deep in the heart of what is now Turkey lies the remains of Göbekli Tepe, a site so ancient that it predates Stonehenge by over 6,000 years. But here's what makes this place truly incredible. The people who built these massive stone circles weren't supposed to exist according to everything we thought we knew about human development. They were hunter-gatherers, yet somehow they organized thousands of workers to create monuments that required advanced engineering knowledge we're still trying to understand today. The pillar carvings at Göbekli Tepe tell stories that archaeologists are only now beginning to decode. These aren't simple drawings. They're complex mythological narratives featuring creatures that seem to blend the natural and supernatural worlds in ways that challenge our understanding of early human consciousness. One recurring image shows a headless human figure surrounded by vultures and scorpions, suggesting a myth about death and rebirth that's unlike anything we've seen from this time period. But here's where it gets really fascinating. Recent research suggests that the myths carved into these stones might actually be astronomical maps, tracking the movement of stars and constellations across thousands of years. Imagine ancient people creating myths that were simultaneously stories about their gods and precise scientific instruments for tracking time itself. This isn't primitive thinking. This is sophisticated intellectual work that combines storytelling, astronomy, and engineering in ways that we're still trying to fully comprehend. Now let me take you even further back in time to a civilization that most people have never heard of. The Vinca culture flourished in southeastern Europe over 7,000 years ago, and they left behind something that has completely baffled researchers. They created what might be the world's oldest writing system, but here's the problem. Nobody can read it. These symbols found on pottery and artifacts throughout their territory seem to tell stories, but the stories remain locked away from us. What we do know about Vinca mythology comes from their incredible artwork and sculptures. They created figurines that seem to depict gods or supernatural beings with features that don't match any known human characteristics. Some have elongated heads, others have multiple eyes, and many seem to be wearing elaborate costumes or masks that suggest complex religious ceremonies. These aren't crude representations. They're detailed, sophisticated artworks that suggest a rich mythological tradition we've completely lost. The most intriguing Vinca artifacts are the so-called temple models, miniature buildings that seem to depict sacred spaces where their mythological stories might have been enacted. Inside these models, archaeologists have found tiny figurines arranged in what appear to be ritual scenes. It's like discovering a dollhouse version of an ancient religious ceremony, giving us glimpses into myths and practices that existed thousands of years before the pyramids were built. But perhaps the most mind-blowing forgotten mythology comes from a place you've definitely never heard of. The Cucuteni Tripilia culture built some of the largest settlements in prehistoric Europe, with cities that housed up to 15,000 people. These weren't small villages. These were massive urban centers with sophisticated planning and organization. And then, every 70 to 80 years, they would deliberately burn down their entire city and build a new one somewhere else. Think about that for a moment. Imagine your entire community deciding to destroy everything they've built and start over from scratch. This wasn't happening because of wars or disasters. Archaeological evidence shows these were planned, ritualistic burnings. The entire community would participate in systematically destroying their homes, their temples, their workshops, everything they'd spent decades creating. Why would an advanced civilization deliberately destroy itself over and over again? The answer lies in their forgotten mythology, a belief system centered around cycles of death and rebirth that went far beyond individual human lives. These people believed that their cities, like living beings, had lifespans that needed to end for new life to begin. The burning wasn't destruction, it was transformation, a mythological process that ensured their community remained spiritually healthy. Recent excavations have revealed that before each burning, the Cucuteni Tripilia people would create elaborate ritual deposits burying specially crafted objects that seem to tell the story of their city's life and death. These aren't random artifacts. They're carefully arranged collections of pottery, tools, and figurines that appear to narrate the mythological journey their community was about to undertake. What's absolutely incredible is that we're finding evidence of similar cyclical destruction and rebirth patterns in other forgotten cultures around the world. In ancient Anatolia, settlements show signs of deliberate abandonment and rebuilding. In parts of prehistoric China, entire communities seem to have moved in coordinated patterns that suggest mythological beliefs about the proper relationship between humans and the landscape. These aren't isolated incidents, they're glimpses into a completely different way of understanding time, community, and the relationship between human civilization and the natural world. These forgotten cultures developed mythologies so sophisticated that they guided massive coordinated community actions across generations. But here's what really gets me excited about these discoveries. We're not just learning about ancient people. We're discovering that human consciousness and creativity have been far more complex and sophisticated for far longer than we ever imagined. These forgotten myths aren't primitive stories told around campfires. They're evidence of advanced thinking, complex social organization, and spiritual beliefs that rival anything we see in recorded history. And we've barely scratched the surface. There are dozens of other forgotten civilizations whose mythological traditions are waiting to be rediscovered, decoded, and shared with the world. The deeper we dig into these lost worlds, the more we realize that our ancestors weren't just surviving. They were creating complex intellectual frameworks that would make modern philosophers jealous. Take the Harappan civilization, for example. Most people know them as the Indus Valley civilization, but what they don't know is that these people developed urban planning so advanced that their cities had better drainage systems than many modern towns. But their mythology, that's where things get absolutely wild. The Harappans left behind thousands of seals covered in symbols that tell stories we're still desperately trying to understand. These aren't just decorative images, they're narrative sequences that seem to depict gods engaging in activities that blur the line between the mundane and the miraculous. One recurring motif shows a figure sitting in what appears to be a yoga pose, surrounded by animals that seem to be listening to him speak. This isn't just art, this is evidence of mythological traditions that might have influenced spiritual practices we still use today. But here's what makes Harappan mythology truly fascinating. Their cities show no evidence of kings, palaces, or social hierarchies that we see in other ancient civilizations. Yet they managed to coordinate massive construction projects and maintain consistent cultural practices across hundreds of miles. How do you organize a civilization without traditional power structures? The answer might lie in their forgotten myths, stories that created social cohesion through shared spiritual beliefs rather than political authority. Recent underwater archaeology off the coast of India has revealed submerged structures that might be Harappan cities lost to rising sea levels thousands of years ago. Imagine the myths that might be preserved in those underwater ruins, creation stories and flood narratives that could completely rewrite our understanding of how ancient people understood catastrophic change and survival. Now let me take you to a place that will completely mess with your understanding of prehistoric human capability. The Nabta Playa stone circle in southern Egypt is older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than almost any monument you can think of. But this wasn't built by a great civilization with thousands of workers. This was constructed by nomadic cattle herders, who somehow developed astronomical knowledge that rivals what we see in much later cultures. The stones at Nabta Playa are arranged to track the summer solstice, the heliacal rising of specific stars, and even the precession of the equinoxes. That last one is particularly mind-blowing because precession takes over 26,000 years to complete a full cycle. These nomadic people were thinking and planning on timescales that most modern humans can barely comprehend. What myths drove these herders to create such sophisticated astronomical monuments? We're finding clues in rock art scattered throughout the Sahara. Images that seem to depict cattle as cosmic beings, stars as supernatural entities that could be influenced through proper ritual behavior. These forgotten myths suggest that ancient Africans understood the connection between earthly seasons and celestial movements in ways that guided not just their agricultural practices but their entire spiritual worldview. That's the most incredible part. We're discovering that this astronomical knowledge spread far beyond the Sahara. Sites in Europe, Asia, and the Americas show similar sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics, suggesting that these forgotten myths might have been part of a global network of knowledge sharing that predates any known historical connections between these regions. Speaking of global connections, let me blow your mind with something most archaeologists are still arguing about. The Antikythera mechanism found in a shipwreck off the Greek coast is basically an ancient computer designed to predict the positions of celestial bodies. But here's the thing that nobody talks about. The mathematical principles underlying this device show up in myths and stories from cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. The Babylonians told stories about gods who could see the future by reading the movements of stars. The Maya developed creation myths that involved precise calculations of planetary cycles. Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime stories contain astronomical information that tracks stellar movements across thousands of years. These aren't coincidences. These are fragments of a forgotten global mythology that treated astronomy not as science but as narrative, as story, as the language through which humans could understand their place in the cosmos. But perhaps the most haunting forgotten mythology comes from the people who built the massive stone heads on Easter Island. Everyone knows about the statues, but almost nobody knows about the mythology that drove their creation. The Rapa Nui people believed that their ancestors could inhabit these stone figures, literally bringing them to life through proper ritual practices. Recent research has revealed that many of these statues have bodies buried beneath centuries of soil accumulation. They're not just heads. They're full figures, some over 30 feet tall, with detailed carvings that tell complex mythological narratives about the relationship between the living and the dead. But here's what makes this mythology truly tragic. The Rapa Nui people deforested their entire island creating these monuments, suggesting myths so powerful that an entire civilization was willing to sacrifice their environment to honor them. The Easter Island story gets even more mysterious when you consider the Rongorongo script, a writing system that appeared on the island and then disappeared completely. The few surviving Rongorongo tablets seem to contain mythological narratives, but they're written in a script so unique that scholars debate whether it's actually writing or some other form of symbolic communication. Imagine having the keys to an entire mythological tradition sitting in museums around the world, but lacking the ability to unlock the stories they contain. These forgotten myths aren't just academic curiosities. They're windows into ways of thinking and being that challenge everything we assume about human development and consciousness. They suggest that our ancestors were far more sophisticated, far more connected, and far more capable of complex abstract thinking than we've ever given them credit for. And here's what really keeps me up at night thinking about all this. We're living through our own mythological age right now, creating stories about artificial intelligence, space exploration, and genetic engineering that future archaeologists might struggle to understand. What if the myths we're creating today seem just as bizarre and incomprehensible to people thousands of years from now? The question that haunts me most is this. What if these forgotten civilizations didn't just disappear randomly? What if their mythologies predicted their own endings and they chose to follow those predictions to their logical conclusions? This isn't as crazy as it sounds when you start looking at the evidence. Take the Minoan civilization on Crete. Most people think they were wiped out by the volcanic eruption at Thera, but recent archaeological evidence suggests something far more intriguing. The Minoans seem to have gradually abandoned their cities and sacred sites years before the eruption occurred. Their final artworks and pottery show increasingly dark themes depicting gods turning away from humanity and natural disasters consuming the world. Here's where it gets absolutely wild. Linear A, the undeciphered Minoan script, appears most frequently in their final archaeological layers. It's almost as if they were desperately trying to record something crucial before time ran out. Some researchers believe these final inscriptions might be prophecies or mythological instructions for surviving the end of their world. Imagine an entire civilization following a mythological roadmap for their own apocalypse. But the Minoans weren't unique in this regard. The ancestral Puebloans in the American Southwest built incredible cliff dwellings and then mysteriously abandoned them in the 13th century. Traditional archaeology blames drought or warfare, but recent analysis of their final pottery and rock art reveals something much stranger. These images show increasing references to underworld journeys and transformation myths, suggesting their abandonment might have been a ritualistic following of mythological cycles rather than a response to environmental pressure. The most chilling example comes from the Mississippian culture at Cahokia. This was the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico with over 20,000 inhabitants at its peak. The archaeological evidence shows they didn't just abandon the city. They systematically dismantled it, carefully removing specific artifacts and ritual objects before walking away forever. Their final earthworks seem to tell a story about the world ending and beginning again. A mythological cycle that required the deliberate destruction of their greatest achievement. What's absolutely mind-bending is that we're finding similar patterns of mythologically driven abandonment in cultures that had no contact with each other. The builders of Great Zimbabwe in Africa, the Chachapoya cloud warriors in Peru, the Khmer Empire at Angkor Wat. All of these civilizations show evidence of gradual systematic abandonment that seems to follow mythological rather than practical logic. This suggests something profound about human consciousness that we're only beginning to understand. These weren't primitive people making irrational decisions. These were sophisticated cultures with complex mythological frameworks that guided their understanding of time, change, and the proper relationship between human civilization and cosmic order. But here's what really blows my mind. Some of these forgotten mythologies seem to contain information that we're only now rediscovering through modern science. The Dogon people of Mali have oral traditions that describe the orbital mechanics of Sirius B, a white dwarf star that wasn't discovered by Western astronomy until the 1920s. Their myths contain precise details about stellar evolution, binary star systems, and gravitational relationships that shouldn't have been observable without telescopes. Similarly, Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime stories contain geographical information about land formations that were submerged over 10,000 years ago. These myths describe underwater mountains, rivers, and coastlines with accuracy that matches modern sonar mapping of the ocean floor. How do oral traditions preserve precise scientific information across hundreds of generations? The answer might lie in the way these forgotten cultures understood the relationship between story and reality. For them, myths weren't just entertainment or spiritual beliefs. They were sophisticated information storage systems, ways of encoding crucial knowledge in memorable narrative forms that could survive catastrophic changes in their civilization. Consider the flood myths that appear in cultures worldwide. We tend to think of these as primitive explanations for natural disasters. But recent geological research suggests they might be accurate historical records of actual events. The Younger Dryas period, which ended about 11,700 years ago, saw massive climate changes, rising sea levels, and catastrophic flooding across the globe. The mythological details in flood stories from completely separate cultures match the geological evidence with startling precision. These forgotten myths force us to confront an uncomfortable truth about our own civilization. We think we're the first humans to develop sophisticated ways of understanding reality. But the evidence suggests our ancestors were asking the same profound questions we're asking today. They just encoded their answers in stories instead of scientific papers. Every archaeological discovery, every decoded symbol, every translated fragment brings us closer to understanding that human consciousness has always been far more complex and interconnected than we ever imagined. The real question isn't what these ancient people believed. The real question is, what stories are we creating right now that future civilizations will struggle to understand?